007 Legends was the final grasp of Activision's Bond tenure, and let's not mince words, it was pretty well the undisputed bottom of the barrel when it comes to the Craig-era Bond games, and it sits with a fittingly dismal Metacritic score and reads like a series of indictments, which is never a good thing. Critics rightfully slammed the soulless Call of Duty gunplay and the total lack of innovation, but that pales in comparison to the narrative, which is meant to be a greatest hits collection from each of the Bond eras brought together in a game to celebrate the 50th anniversary, and that's all awkwardly retrofitted with Daniel Craig's likeness, but trust me, that's the least of the game's problems. It launched alongside Skyfall in 2012 and was marketed as the ultimate tie-in, yet in a move of pure corporate genius, the Skyfall mission at the end wasn't even on the disc, so you had to download it later to, quote, avoid spoilers, which obviously is a decision that's aged like milk since the PS3 and 360 stores are now entirely offline, which means completing the game is effectively impossible. That is, of course, unless you own the version on the Wii U, which was printed later, so that mission actually came on the disc, which, interestingly enough, has made that version of the game quite valuable, which is kind of funny because, well, the other two aren't really that valuable at all. Anyway, I've done the unthinkable and I've returned to the legend to see if it truly is the disaster that history tells us, or if there's a legendary spark buried under all of the recycled assets and confusing narrative. So, reluctantly, let's begin, shall we? The game wastes no time starting you on the Skyfall train, which is where we see the game's depiction of when Bond falls victim to the most unlucky case of friendly fire, because honestly, look where she is, and look where Bond is, and then look where he falls. Ain't no way she's making that shot. Anyway, he takes a bullet, he falls into the river, and has all of these bubble dreams, which honestly are so bad I've got no idea who even they're meant to be, but luckily were saved by a few notable lines like, "No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die." So if you're familiar with the old films, you'll know that that's from Goldfinger, which released in 1964, way before anyone watching this video was even born, and I've gonna be honest, I'm not that familiar with the Bond films pre the Brosnan era, so this was a bit of a blur for me, and I can't really recount them without watching some clips or something, so I'm just not as familiar with the films I didn't grow up with, and frankly, the Legends package didn't really help me remember them, which I suppose you could consider strike one on the board for the story, but to be honest, not all of the missions are impossible to recognize, and if I'm giving the game its due, it doesn't do a terrible job with some of them, but we'll definitely get to that. So Goldfinger abruptly starts, Bond has a hangover, and there's a woman painted gold on the bed. Now, although that might be considered one of the most notable Bond moments from any film, it doesn't actually do anything for the game other than look like one of those unmistakable Bond moments that they can use in the marketing, which they absolutely did, with this moment being on the game's cover. So I think a lot of the moments are less to serve the game and more to sell it, if that makes any sense. And just before we get too far, I just want to take a moment to appreciate the cover art, by the way, because I don't think I'm the first person to point this out, but if anything should serve as a warning that this game might not be that great, then I don't know what does, because this is like they accidentally sent the placeholder to be printed or something. It's really amateur stuff that just really doesn't set the scene very well, and you can see all of these famous Bond scenes, like I think Jaws is on there, the Gold Lady, and quite frankly, it's an awful cover and sets the scene perfectly, I suppose you could say. Right then, anyway, so the mission starts and you're infiltrating a base of some description to destroy some jets, and wait a minute, no, I've used the wrong footage, hang on. So yeah, you infiltrate a base, you destroy a load of jets, which I thought was meant to be on the QT, but never mind, and this is where you'll get your first taste of the gameplay, which you'll be pleased to know is actually a marked improvement from GoldenEye Reloaded, and if you watched my review on that, you'll remember how I talked about the lack of feedback and the limp-sounding guns. Well, Legends pretty well puts all of those issues to rest, and miraculously, the gunplay doesn't feel that bad at all. There's blood effects, there's passable gun sounds, and shock horror, the corpses don't disappear, which honestly I'm still in a state of shock about after I played Reloaded, but I'll do my best to keep on topic. So yeah, the Legends gunplay is actually alright, and although the game isn't based on the COD engine, it certainly feels like it could have been, and well, it looks like it too. But that's actually a good thing when it comes to the feel, because comparing it to a shooter like COD from a gameplay perspective is pretty high praise. It targets 60 FPS, has slick movement, shooting and aiming, and frankly there's not really much to complain about, which is a rare note of positivity for this video, so enjoy it while it lasts. Like Reloaded, you're able to carry 3 weapons, but this time you can actually drop the P99 entirely in favour for something else, though the game is a bit weird about what you can swap out, and I think that happens because you're only able to carry one of each type of weapon, so 1 rifle, 1 SMG, and 1 pistol. And if you try and swap the P99 for a rifle, it won't let you. You'll drop whatever other rifle you already have. So you need to keep that in mind when you're going around swapping stuff, because it isn't always for the weapon that you've got in your hand. And I found that simple mechanic a little bit confusing for some reason. Why can't I just swap what's in my hand? I don't know. So you'll always have 3 different weapons, whatever the case, but I do think it's a bit weird how we've gone from not being able to drop the P99 in Reloaded to having any 3 weapons in Legends. And I suppose in Legends it makes a bit more sense, but there was something about Bond keeping his P99 that part of me liked, and I ended up avoiding other pistols almost entirely for the most part. But I suppose there is the angle that game balance would be affected if you were able to just pick up 3 assault rifles. So the weapon system probably makes it so that the mechanics are balanced rather than you just being able to walk around like a one-man army. But that small annoyance of not always swapping what's in your hand was something that bothered me right up until the end of the game, which makes me wish that you could just keep your P90 and it was more streamlined and you were able to just swap the other 2. This way round just feels like it's a bit clunky and frankly it's a bit shit and not as good as the Reloaded system. But then again, there is the agency of deciding all 3 of those weapons, so it's a bit of a toss-up really and just what you prefer. What isn't shit though, and I can't believe I'm saying this, is the attachment system for the weapons and the upgrades and perks alongside them. Throughout the game you'll see these little black pelican cases, and inside you'll see a suite of upgrades, weapons attachments, and gadgets that can all be purchased with XP. And XP is what you'll earn for doing various things in the game, like completing objectives and fulfilling certain criteria. The perks on offer don't do a lot to light the world on fire or anything, and in fact they're pretty much the standard COD affair, like reloading faster, swapping weapons faster, and more resilience to explosives, shit like that. For the most part, I kind of forgot that these were a thing, and I don't think they were as impactful as they could have been, but it's still something that the game offers you, so it's not something that you should really moan about, and it's just a shame they weren't more useful, really. The custom weapon attachments, though, which was one of the things missing from Reloaded, I actually quite liked. Instead of only being able to pick up custom guns, now you can make them, which for a game that's basically 99% gunfights, it adds a well-needed layer to the gameplay and lets you run with kits tailored to whatever you want. The attachments on offer are the standard affair of sights, barrel mods, and extended mags, but once you get a few different attachments on your gun and build a bit of a loadout, it does actually make the game feel a bit more varied and enjoyable to play. I especially enjoyed getting larger mags for the SMGs, which let me run around like a squirrel on fire, and then making this unholy triple attachment pistol for stealth, which I already said I didn't do, but I did. It was pretty good fun. And don't get me wrong, it's no gunsmith, but it's a welcome change for an otherwise pretty dull shooter that doesn't do much in the way of gameplay options, so having this suite of upgrades for your weapons was definitely a welcome change from Reloaded, and something that I actually look back on fondly, which is strange. And that leads me nicely to talk about the gadgets, and since I've already made a few comparisons to Reloaded already, I'm going to go ahead and make another comparison, but essentially Legends is the same game, just with a few bolted on additions, and Gadgets is one of them, and it's a supposed improvement. So you have gadgets available to you, which you can see in the upgrade menu too, but weirdly, half of the stuff in there isn't actually something that you need to unlock. You start with the smartphone and its 3 modes, the fingerprint mode, the hacking mode, and the photo mode, but for some reason they're listed in the menu as if you can upgrade them. They're not. You get these by default as part of the story, so I don't really know why they're in this upgrade box. And the same goes for your watch abilities too, the laser and the motion sensor. They just get given to you, so again, I don't know why they're in the Pelican case. So the watch has a couple of modes, like I said, and it's meant for silently taking down cameras or distracting guards. It has like this little laser that you direct at something, which is annoyingly slow, and because of that I barely used it, so it's almost always more efficient to just use your gun and be done with it. So using the watch is more quiet, but there's definitely a trade-off because it takes forever. And then there's the second mode, which is the motion sensor, which is fine, I guess, but its main job is highlighting how broken the minimap is, really. And again, unlike Reloaded, where the minimap had every enemy as a permanent dot, the map in Legends is incredibly hit and miss, and I've got no idea what the criteria is for an enemy to appear on the radar. But the watch pings everyone regardless, so it feels cool to check your wrist. And sure, the watch is essentially just doing the job that the minimap should be doing in the first place, and I'd actually prefer if they'd just pick one. Either give me a reliable minimap or take it away entirely so I have to rely on the watch and it actually feels consequential. And speaking of consequential, let's quickly talk about the phone modes. So there's three, one for fingerprint detection, one for hacking, and then one for taking pictures. So it's just like your phone, really. And to be honest, this is one of the areas of the game which I think is a little bit weird, because you never really use the phone until you get to the sections of the game where you're in the boss's offices, which is where you use these modes. Now, there are a few sections in the game where you hack turrets and have to hack a few doors, but that's really quite rare, and the main reason that you're going to be using the phone is when you get to the end of the mission and you have to scan the guy's office for fingerprints and then unlock a safe. So it's really a little bit odd that the gadgets have been added to the game and you don't really use most of them, or at least the phone, until you get to these specific sections, which are just completely recycled for almost every mission. It's a little bit weird. So the phone went mostly unused until you got to these repeated sections where you have to scan for fingerprints and unlock a load of bullshit, which is the main place you find all of the intel, which is one of the things you can collect for more XP and some achievements. But yeah, I obviously didn't do that. And then you've got the pen, which, in all fairness, probably is mightier than the sword in this case. Unlike the phone and the watch, this actually has a progression that you can unlock in the Pelican case for the three modes, which are the Tranquilizer, the Law, and Distraction Darts. Now, if you recall my Reloaded review, I did actually complain about the total lack of equipment, and this should be a step in the right direction, right? Because this finally allows you to use gadgets. And for the most part, that's true. But the problem is, the functionality is almost identical as shooting them with the pistol, with a silencer, so naturally, I almost never pulled it out. And it's the same story for the laws and the distractions. I spent 10 minutes moaning about the lack of tools in Reloaded, only to then proceed to ignore them entirely in Legends. It's a bit of a cell phone, I guess, and it's only really because these tools are just, well, useless. And for the most part, they only offer the illusion of agency and don't offer enough to feel novel, and certainly don't add enough value to make them worth the extra button presses. And when the game is built on the foundation of shoot everything that moves, you're always going to be taking the path of least resistance, and in Legends, that path is paved with stone, and this fancy little pen just ends up staying in your pocket, even if it does provide a few little extra ways of playing the game. And another reason that the pen ends up staying in your pocket is down to the stealth itself, which, much like the level design, is essentially a game of follow the leader. You approach a guy, you make sure his mates aren't looking, and you press a button to delete him, either by shooting him in the head with your pistol or taking him down with a QTE. And it's the same loop as Reloaded, though Legends does actually improve the system marginally. Now you have a cautionary phase, so if you're spotted, it isn't just an instant global alarm. The guard will casually wander over to investigate, giving you a window to hide or take him down. And it's definitely a step in the right direction, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The AI is still remarkably stupid and remains mostly unchanged from Reloaded. The levels do offer clearly defined stealth options like vents instead of doors or conveniently placed crates, and of course guards who have been professionally trained to stare at a very specific patch of drywall. And it all feels less like you're infiltrating a high security base and more like a trip to IKEA. It's contrived, it's dull, and most importantly, the game doesn't really reward you for doing it, so you end up just shooting your way through everything. That is, of course, unless you're going through the forced stealth sections, which are doable, just not really that enjoyable. Despite the laws, the distraction tools, and the cool watch, the game never really gives you a reason to be a ghost, and when being a tank and going loud is much faster and to the point, that second option of stealth facade really breaks down, and you just end up taking the path of least resistance, which is pretty much what you do for this entire game. You avoid a lot of the mechanics in favor for just shooting stuff, which is a shame, really. So yeah, it turns out that even with a utility belt full of gadgets, Bond's most effective tool is still just his gun. But occasionally the game decides you've had enough fun with the gunplay and forces you into what I can only describe as a series of chaotic boss fights. If the shooting was a marked improvement, the melee combat is a massive leap backwards down into a canyon, or off a train, if you will. Every single iconic villain encounter from Oddjob to Jaws is reduced to a scripted first-person brawl that plays like some sort of budget Kinect game or something. You wiggle the analog sticks to dodge, wait for a prompt, and then you waggle them again to punch wherever it tells you to. It's repetitive, it's clunky, and it completely robs these legendary henchmen of any sort of menace. And you aren't really defeating a villain more than you're just participating in this terrible QTE. And by the way, it's the exact same system in place for just random guards. So it's not even a special system in place for the bosses, it's just longer, and you repeat the same thing for just a random henchman. It's really awful, and one thing that just really sticks out as something that's just absolutely terrible about the game, I think this is probably the single worst, most clunky, terrible thing in the game, which is obviously saying something, so yeah, it's pretty bad. And seeing all these iconic characters face to face would be pretty cool, but it doesn't help that the narrative is a complete structural disaster. Because it's framed as this near-death dream or nightmare, the game feels like Bond's brain is surfing through the last 50 years of Bond history, and he isn't quite present for it. One minute you're in the 1960s on an alpine retreat, the next you're in a high-tech space station, yet Daniel Craig is still there the whole time, and it's all a bit weird. And if you're not a Bond historian, you're probably going to have no idea what's going on. And the story is kind of told on a per mission basis, but calling it a story is a bit of a stretch, really. They're just vertical slices of a few films in game form, and that's about it, really. It's disconnected, random, and doesn't feel like something that would ever stay with you, despite all of the iconic moments it does indeed throw at you. It's just really poorly put together, forgettable, and that's, as I said, despite the iconic moments. And then there's the voice acting, and oh boy, the voice acting. While they did actually manage to get Judi Dench and Rory Kinnear to reprise their roles, the man himself is missing, which you might be surprised to hear. Daniel Craig is conspicuously absent from the recording booth here, and while he's technically in the credits, he actually isn't voicing Bond. And if you listen closely, you can actually tell it's an imposter. But honestly, I've got to give this guy his due. I spent half the game thinking it was actually Daniel Craig, just with a particularly nasty head cold or something. And to be fair, Craig's efforts in Quantum and Reloaded weren't exactly Oscar-worthy anyway, so the swap is neither here nor there, really, and it just adds another layer to this general uncanny atmosphere the rest of the game radiates. And honestly, the same goes for the rest of the cast. Some of the villains use the actual likeness and the voices of the original actors, and some definitely don't. But by this point, with the erratic time jumps and the bizarre brawling mechanics, quite honestly, I just don't care. The game is such a disjointed grab bag of themes and assets that I eventually just found myself glazing over and waiting for the credits to pull me out of my misery. Though in some sort of final act of desperation, the game does actually try something different for the final mission, which is Moonraker. It's easily the most novel mission in the entire package, mostly because you finally break the IKEA corridor mold and you get some interesting new mechanics like Zero-G and some actually interesting sci-fi weaponry. And it's all in a setting which is absolutely nothing like the rest of the game. But in classic Legends fashion, the novelty is also the biggest problem. It doesn't feel like James Bond, and certainly not the gritty, grounded Craig era that it's supposed to be playing through. So despite it looking kinda cool to float around in Zero-G, it feels a lot more like a disregarded Call of Duty map from Ghosts or something, and much less like a Bond game, which obviously it's meant to be. It's far more like a generic Space Marine shooter than it is James Bond, and honestly, it's one of the most bizarre, tonally deaf ways to end a trilogy. And then you remember that this isn't actually meant to be the end of the game, because this is missing the Skyfall mission, so we don't even get to finish the game. We're left with a tonally mismatched game with no ending, and quite frankly, it's no wonder that Activision lost the license after this complete, utter mess of a game. And if you're thinking about playing it, think twice, because all those review scores I mentioned at the start of the video, well, they're more or less true, which doesn't give me any pleasure to say.